In the Turkmen language, Arkadag means protector. That's the title of Turkmenistan's president from 2006 to 2022, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow. But you can also call Berdimuhamedow a dictator. He recently gave his son, Serdar Berdimuhamedow, the presidency, while naming himself national leader of the Turkmen people and becoming chairman of the People's Council. This effectively gives him supreme authority over the government in Turkmenistan, which was already one of the world's most repressive countries. Critics of the government are thrown in jail and never seen again. There is no independent media to speak of. Government corruption is through the roof. Meanwhile, mass propaganda praises the leaders as demigods. But despite the almost comical level of repression, Turkmenistan is becoming more and more important on the world stage. It looms as a significant player in the three-sided geopolitical contest between China, Russia, and the United States, because of its position and its natural resources. The news coming out of Turkmenistan is pretty confusing, with some claiming there is a geopolitical pivot to the west, while others are warning about growing Russian and Chinese influence. The reality is, who Turkmenistan allies itself with is fully up to the dictator to decide. A dictator who cares about himself first and foremost. So let's try to understand what's going on in this country, and how it has become such a ruthless dictatorship. Now, in order to understand how Turkmenistan became one of the world's most repressive dictatorships, you need to understand its history. And to understand its history, you need to understand the Great Game, the geopolitical rivalry between the British and Russian empires in Central Asia in the 19th century. The two empires were driven by two things: mutual distrust and a desire for colonial possessions. The Great Game unfolded across the steppes, mountains, and deserts of Central Asia, turning the region into a vast geopolitical chessboard. For the Russians, the advance to Central Asia allowed them to secure their own southern frontier and project power towards the rich trade routes of the Indian subcontinent. The British, meanwhile, wanted to make inroads into Central Asia to protect their prize colony in India. Russian leadership, Tsar Alexander II, knew that controlling the Caspian Sea would link his empire to Central Asia and provide a natural barrier to British influence. But he also knew that controlling the Caspian Sea would require subduing Turkmenistan, or Turkestan as it was called then. A land of hardy nomads and ancient caravanserais, Turkestan bore no resemblance to either the grand empires of the 19th century or the modern nation-states of today. Instead, it was a patchwork of fiercely independent tribes whose warriors were skilled horsemen and sharpshooters, and their way of life deeply rooted in the unforgiving desert. However, the same independence which allowed each tribe to survive in harsh conditions would ultimately prove its undoing, as Russian forces exploited inter-tribal rivalries to divide and conquer. In January of 1881, General Mikhail Skobolov led his men to the final obstacle between them and control over Turkestan, an ancient stronghold called Gyoktepe. Using explosives, the Russian broke through the fortress after weeks of fighting, and they slaughtered every Turkmen they saw. Gyoktepe fell, and so did the organized Turkmen resistance to Russian aggression. But as it turned out, Turkmenistan would outlive the Russian Empire. After 2 revolutions and a bloody civil war, the Tsar was replaced by the Bolsheviks in the early 20th century. Yet this was no reason for the people in Turkmenistan to get their hopes up. Seeking to consolidate their power in Russian peripheral territories, the Bolsheviks quickly launched a campaign to integrate Central Asia into the Soviet Union. After a brief period of resistance from local leaders who saw communism as an ideology opposed to their traditions, the region was formally incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1925. This marked the beginning of the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic. The Bolsheviks regarded the traditional Turkmen way of life as incompatible with communism, so they set about to change it. Nomadic herders were settled into collective farms. Traditional tribal hierarchies were dismantled, and Islam's influence was curtailed through state atheism. The Bolsheviks believed Turkmen culture needed to be pacified before the territory's natural resources could be fully exploited. And boy, oh boy, did Turkmenistan have a lot to bring to the Soviet Union's industries. Recognizing that the land was perfect for cotton cultivation, the Soviets launched an ambitious program to transform Turkmenistan into a major supplier. Vast stretches of the Karakum Desert, which occupy more than 70% of modern Turkmenistan, were irrigated and brought under cultivation, and cotton began feeding mills in Moscow and Leningrad. But cotton wasn't the reason Turkmenistan became so important to the Soviet Union, and ultimately to 21st century geopolitics. The real reason was the discovery of major natural gas reserves. In 1959, the first industrial flows were obtained in the central Karakum Desert. soon followed by the discovery of a significant gas field in eastern Turkmenistan. These discoveries made Soviet authorities realize they needed to develop a fully fledged energy industry in the country. They founded a state gas company, and when another, even bigger gas field was found in eastern Turkmenistan, began work on a pipeline to Russia. Yet despite the transformation of Turkmenistan's economic potential, the political elite maintained the same attitude. It was a territory to be exploited. Moscow sucked Turkmenistan dry. Biblical amounts of water were diverted to irrigate massive cotton farms, and huge amounts of gas flowed to Russian homes and factories. Almost nothing was left for Turkmenistan. By the late 1980s, the country's per capita income was just 70% of the Soviet average, even though Turkmenistan was producing 72 billion cubic meters of natural gas every year, second only to Russia itself. Turkmenistan's political elite was completely loyal to Moscow. They had to be. But especially when they began to see that the Soviet Union was crumbling apart, there was intense internal competition for power and influence. That competition was eventually won by a man called Sapar Niyazov. Niyazov was born in February 1940 in a modest village just 20 miles from the Gyoktepe stronghold where the Russian Empire defeated the Turkmen. According to his official biography, Niyazov's father died courageously fighting against Nazi Germany in World War II, and his mother perished in the powerful earthquake which leveled Ashgabat, the capital city of Turkmenistan, in 1948. Just like so many children his age, Niyazov became an orphan. But instead of having to fend for himself on the streets, he was placed into a children's home and looked after until an uncle took him in. He attended the best schools in Ashgabat and studied at the prestigious Polytechnic Institute of Leningrad, where he graduated in electrical engineering. Niyazov didn't rise through the ranks of the Communist Party of Turkmenistan because he was especially intelligent. He was a survivor. As his rivals were purged for ideological errors or corruption scandals, he kept his head down until he was the last man standing. He made a name for himself as one of the most conservative leaders in the Soviet Union and a staunch opponent of Mikhail Gorbachev's political reforms. Niyazov wanted to maintain a powerful Soviet Union, and apparently so did the people of Turkmenistan. In a referendum held in March of 1991, a surprisingly suspicious 99.8% of the population voted to remain part of the Soviet Union. But after a hardline coup against Mikhail Gorbachev failed and the collapse of the Soviet Union became obvious, Niyazov was smart enough to see the writing on the wall. He called a second referendum. 94% of Turkmenistan's voting population were now apparently in favor of leaving the Soviet Union. On October 27, 1991, Turkmenistan declared independence. Less than 2 months later, the Soviet hammer and sickle flag were lowered for the last time over the Kremlin. The grandest experiment in political history was over, and a new era was about to begin. It was great news for Niyazov, and bad news for almost everyone else in Turkmenistan. As Turkmenistan was declaring its independence, the country voted on who should be appointed president. Niyazov was elected with a 98.3% majority, I'm seeing a pattern here. In the first few months of his presidency, he made some cosmetic changes which gestured in the direction of democracy, like renaming the Communist Party of Turkmenistan to the Democratic Party of Turkmenistan. The people of Turkmenistan were desperate to believe that Niyazov was the leader to guide them through uncharted waters. However, that hope soon turned into bitter disappointment. Niyazov quickly assumed an iron grip on every facet of Turkmen society. Central to Niyazov's reign was the creation of an elaborate and often surreal cult of personality. This was possible because of two legacies of Soviet rule. The first was the repression of any kind of organic civil society. The Turkmen people were ill-equipped to resist authoritarian rule. The second was that years of experience inside the Soviet political system had made Niyazov good at working the propaganda machine, which he used to convince people he was the father of the nation. In 1992, the state publishing house published several books of extravagant praise for the new president. Sapar Niyazov became Turkmenbashi, leader of the Turkmen. Schools, streets, villages, mosques, factories, airports, vodka brands, and even perfumes were now renamed Turkmenbashi. Statues of Lenin and Marx were toppled and replaced with gold statues of Niyazov, dressed in a suit and tie. To this day, every town in Turkmenistan has an identical statue of Niyazov. Things got even weirder when, in 1995, Turkmenistan was officially recognized as a neutral country by the United Nations. To mark the occasion, Niyazov ordered the construction of a 75-meter tower in the heart of Ashgabat. On top of that tower, which was named the Ark of Neutrality, stood a 12-meter tall statue of himself in a suit and something that looked like a Superman cape. The statue was illuminated at night and rotated during the day, so that Nyasov always faced the sun. The arch itself was made from white marble, a grotesque touch of luxury at a time when most people in the country had almost nothing. There's only one way to go even crazier than building a massive rotating gold statue of yourself, and that's to turn yourself into a god. So that's what Nyasov did. In September of 2021, he published his masterpiece, Runama, the Book of the Soul. The Runama was like a cross between the Quran, a history book, and a book of poetry. Across 2 volumes, Nyasov offered his thoughts on Turkmenistan's history, customs, and culture, interwoven with lyrical descriptions. According to Nyasov, he wrote the Runama to be the essence of the Turkmen mind, Turkmen customs and traditions, intentions, actions, and ideals. Although the Runama was totally bizarre in practice, it made some sense. In theory, every nation is built on a common identity created from myths and legends. Figures such as King Arthur, Emperor Jimmu, and Romulus and Remus are inseparable from the nations and empires they helped bind together. Turkmenistan didn't have any national myths like that because prior to Russian conquest, Turkmen lived as part of nomadic tribes, each with their own customs. And Russian and Soviet rulers deliberately prevented the growth of an organic national consciousness among Turkmeni people because they knew it could lead to their rule being challenged, maybe even overturned. When you look at it this way, as attempts to create a national identity from scratch, the Runama and even the absurd monuments kind of made some sense. But the government propaganda was getting crazier by the day. As if to reinforce the point, Nyasov accompanied its publication by unveiling yet another new monument in Ashgabat, an enormous copy of the Runama that opened at a given time each evening, complete with solemn music. Over loudspeakers, a deep male voice then recited several lines of verse before the covers of the book slowly closed again. Nyasov made the Runama part of the curriculum in primary schools and universities. Kids in the first grade used the Runama to learn and read, while other students used it as their only reference book when studying Turkmenistan's history. Thus, Turkmen schoolchildren learned that Turkmen invented both the wheel and the robot. Yeah. The Runama still didn't fully satisfy Nyasov's ambition to mold society according to his unique vision. So, in 2002, he decided to change the name of the days and months in order to make them more patriotic. The story just keeps getting wilder as we go. January was renamed to Turkmenbashi. April was renamed to Gorban Sultan after Nyasov's mother. September, the month when the Runama was first published, was naturally renamed Runama. And December was renamed to the Turkmen word for neutrality. To us, actions like these, they seem kind of funny, but they were also symptoms of something much more sinister: total control. On the rare occasions everyone was brave enough to ask about the total absence of any kind of democracy, Nyasov explained that due to something called the Turkmen mentality, the country simply wasn't fit for Western-style democracy. Eccentric vanity projects came at the expense of the development of the country's key industries, cotton, oil, and gas, which were plagued by mismanagement and corruption. Instead of driving broader economic growth, revenue was siphoned into secret bank accounts that belonged to Nyasov and his cronies, or simply plowed into more vanity projects. Nyasov's corruption and reckless economic mismanagement was a huge problem, because in the mid-1990s, Russia blocked Turkmen gas from passing through its pipelines to hard currency markets. Without an export market, the production of gas fell sharply, depriving Turkmenistan of one of its major revenue sources and once again increasing its dependency on Moscow. Turkmenistan's foreign debts ballooned to more than 75% of its GDP by 1999, which scared off foreign investors. Healthcare and education, which had been in a relatively good state throughout Soviet rule, collapsed. In 2004, Nyasov temporarily suspended the salary of his health minister, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow, because healthcare workers weren't getting paid. He suggested that people who were worried about their teeth and couldn't see a dentist should chew on chicken bones, kinda like dogs, which he also banned because he didn't like how they smelled. Behind the opulent white marble apartments and monuments, slums were growing as more and more people were pushed into poverty. Many residents became addicted to the opium which poured in, unchecked, from neighboring Afghanistan. Nyasov had learned a very important lesson from his time in the Soviet Union's political machine. If reality didn't live up to expectations, simply change reality until it does. To hide the full scale of the disaster, Nyasov banned doctors from making diagnoses such as AIDS and tuberculosis. Teachers were forbidden from giving poor grades, and the length of compulsory education was reduced from 10 years to 9. But as Niyazov's health began to decline in the early 2000s, so did his ability to obscure reality. Rumors began spreading that Turkmenbashi was sick. In November of 2006, he publicly announced that he'd been taking medication for a heart condition. Just 1 month later, on December 21st, 2006, Turkmen state media solemnly announced that the president had died of a sudden heart attack in the early hours of the morning. He left behind a country that was poorer, sicker, more afraid, and less educated. Niyazov's decision to not name a successor created a power vacuum, which aspiring contenders rushed to try and fill, and which even led some people to optimistically hope that the next president would be a genuine reformer. According to the Constitution, the presidency should have passed to the chairman of the Legislative Assembly. However, instead of being named acting president, he was arrested on spurious charges. The State Security Council instead announced that Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow, the deputy prime minister and minister of health who Niyazov had disciplined for his mismanagement of the health system, would become acting president. He quickly announced elections to determine Niyazov's successor for February of 2007. He was one of 6 candidates. All were members of the Democratic Party of Turkmenistan. So much choice. On February 11th, 2007, Berdimuhamedow was elected with 89% of the vote, and he was sworn in as the second president of independent Turkmenistan immediately afterwards. Niyazov's children were forced to flee the country, bringing a decisive end to their family's involvement in the country's elite politics. Now, Berdimuhamedow followed an interesting path to power. He was actually Niyazov's dentist. He must have done an amazing job because he was appointed Turkmenistan's health minister in 1997, and apart from one scandal, Berdimuhamedow's reputation survived. He was one of the few politicians who survived the crisis of the Niyazov era without ever being fired or thrown in jail. Because of that, and his rapid rise to power, a rumor started spreading that Berdimuhamedow was actually Niyazov's illegitimate son. The much more likely explanation for his rise to power is that Berdimuhamedow was a cunning political operator who played the game and came out on top. It may have made up for a less than stellar intellect. US diplomatic cables leaked by WikiLeaks in 2010 said that Berdimuhamedow does not like people who are smarter than he is, since he's not a very bright guy. He is suspicious of a lot of people. Some political activists and human rights campaigners nurtured a small flicker of optimism for Berdimuhamedow's rule. I mean, surely he couldn't be worse than Niyazov, right? And the first day of his tenure proved some reasons for optimism. Obligatory schooling was increased again to 10 years. The Khromnama was removed from the curriculum, and the months and days were reverted to their old names. But the hope was soon extinguished as it became clear that instead of simply dismantling Niyazov's cult of personality, Berdimuhamedow was intent on constructing his own. In place of the Khromnama, Turkmen pupils were instead assigned books which lavished praise on their new president. Instead of taking Khromnama studies, university students could take Berdimuhamedow studies. Berdimuhamedow's smiling face gazed out at Turkmen people from photographs and posters which were hung up in every city. They were designed to invoke feelings of safety and to remind people that they were always being watched. If you were a curious tourist visiting the capital city, Ashgabat, you would have seen the same portrait of Berdimuhamedow at a passport control, at the city gates, at hotel reception, probably in your room, and in several public places. Berdimuhamedow's cult of personality combined traditional Turkmen symbols with his eccentric personal passions, the main one being horses. Although the insistence on building a bizarre cult of personality made Berdimuhamedow look a lot like his predecessor, there was one very important area where he was very different: the country's energy sector. Under Berdimuhamedow, Russian and Chinese contractors began to work on the Central Asia-China gas pipeline, a system designed to connect the world's 4th largest reserves to the Middle Kingdom. The completion of the first segment of the pipeline system marked a huge turning point in not only Turkmenistan's economic fortunes, but in its diplomatic relations. So much of Turkmenistan's destiny has been determined by Moscow. Russian invasion turned Turkmenistan into a colony. Soviet occupation turned it into a raw materials outpost, and the collapse of the Soviet Union enabled Turkmenistan to draw its own course as an independent state. It was hard to believe this could ever change, but as gas began to flow to China and hard currency flowed the other way, it did. From 2007 to 2014, this shift in trade partners significantly boosted Turkmenistan's economy, which grew by almost 20% every year. Until the inauguration of the pipeline, nearly 70% of Turkmenistan's gas exports transited through Russian pipelines. By 2015, when 2 additional pipelines were constructed, China was buying 95% of Turkmenistan's natural gas exports at premium prices. It makes sense in hindsight, as Russia was getting more and more natural gas from Siberia, and China's energy demand was just skyrocketing. This shift was greatly accelerated by the fact that, in 2009, the combination of a Russian pipeline explosion and a sharp decline in European demand due to the financial crisis led Russia to significantly reduce both the volume and price of the natural gas it bought from Turkmenistan. Instead of looking west, the people of Turkmenistan shifted their focus to the east, to Beijing, and Xi Jinping, their potential savior. This major new financial influx gave Berdimuhamedow all the license he needed to follow in Niyazov's footsteps and lavish massive amounts of money on marble-clad prestige projects and subsidies to keep the populace docile. He launched the development of the Avaza Tourist Zone, a hugely ambitious project with casinos, resorts, and water parks on the Caspian Sea, kind of like Vegas, if it was all made of white marble. Berdimuhamedow oversaw the construction of a major new terminal, built in the shape of a soaring falcon at Ashgabat International Airport. An entire Olympic complex, complete with a brand new national stadium, was built to host the 2017 Asian Indoor and Martial Arts Games. But the focus on tourism didn't pay off. For reference, Turkmenistan got just 14,000 foreign visitors in 2019, most of whom were oil and gas experts. France got 90 million. But while Berdimuhamedow was spending as if the good times would never end, they were about to. The combination of the shale revolution in the United States, OPEC boosting oil production, and weakening global demand caused oil and gas prices to plummet starting in 2014. Turkmenistan's exports halved, wiping out a fifth of its economy. Double-digit budget surpluses soon turned into unsustainable deficits. In 2018, Berdimuhamedow ordered a complete end to free natural gas, electricity, and water, which residents had been enjoying for decades. Efforts to diversify the economy beyond energy, notably in agriculture and textiles, met with only limited success. The fall in energy prices revealed that Berdimuhamedow had wasted an amazing opportunity for real economic modernization on empty resorts and sports stadiums. It was a tragedy, but anyone who complained was just thrown into secret jails. As Berdimuhamedow's health began to decline in the late 2010s, speculation about his succession intensified. And finally, on February 11th, 2022, he announced he would be stepping down as president and replaced by his son, Serdar. Rumors, the main source of information in Turkmenistan, suggested that Serdar's political career began as early as 2016, when his father first started experiencing health problems. In rapid succession, Serdar became a member of parliament, deputy foreign minister, lieutenant governor, governor, minister, and deputy prime minister. Analysts predicted that Serdar could become president as soon as he turned 40, the minimum eligible age. And indeed, his father handed over the reins 5 months after his son became eligible. Except Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow didn't quite hand over the reins. Instead of retiring, he kept his role as chairman of the People's Council and his informal title of Arkadag, protector. Nevertheless, this political transfer of power marked the first dynastic succession in Turkmenistan's history. Serdar could only secure 73% of the vote in an election everyone knew was rigged, deepening questions about the country's political future. Serdar pledged to continue his father's legacy. The first few months were tough. Essential goods were in short supply. Inflation climbed to 14%. According to the official and likely optimistic data, unemployment rose to over 5% according to the Turkmen government, and a staggering 50% according to unofficial data. The situation became so serious that the people of Turkmenistan risked harsh retribution to protest in the streets. Coming to power in such circumstances could have immediately torpedoed Serdar's popularity. But the stars began to align. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's reemergence from the COVID-19 pandemic led to a surge in oil and gas prices. The value of Turkmenistan's gas exports to China, which made up almost all of the country's exports, grew by 51% in 2022. Russia's invasion also made Turkmenistan look better to Western officials, who stopped complaining about the human rights situation and instead began taking up the prospects of energy cooperation. Previously abandoned plans for gas pipelines that would deliver gas from Turkmenistan to Europe, bypassing Russia, were resurrected. Alarmed by the idea of being cut out, Moscow almost tripled its own purchases of Turkmen gas. Suddenly, everybody wanted a piece of Turkmenistan. Serdar reaped the benefits, but that made his father unhappy. When he stepped aside from the presidency, the elder Berdimuhamedow had hoped to pass on the tedium of domestic politics to his son, precisely so he could focus on the fun parts, like meeting with the country's international partners. Now he saw his son traveling to Beijing and Moscow, shaking hands, receiving awards, and enjoying photo opportunities, and decided he wanted to get back into the game. In the space of a year, Gurbanguly visited Russia, Japan, and South Korea, always making sure he was greeted by presidents and prime ministers. This led to an unprecedented situation. Turkmenistan had two leaders, and they were father and son, causing massive confusion. During overlapping foreign visits, Turkmen officials didn't know which Berdimuhamedow to accompany or who should be allocated the motorcade and security, and state media journalists didn't know whose visits they should show on the news first. Sardar's behavior at home, such as removing his father's sister from a prestigious post, bringing his mother back into the public eye, and appointing a new prosecutor general, made Gurbanguly even more determined to reassert his primacy. Just 11 months after he stepped down as president, Gurbanguly launched a reform that transformed the upper house of the bicameral parliament, which he led, into a unicameral body with nearly unlimited powers. No important changes could be made without its approval, and the president was now placed at the same level of seniority as ministers. If the head of state can't perform their duties, power is automatically transferred to the chairman of the new super chamber, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedow. As the head of the most important body, Gurbanguly now occupies the country's most powerful position. He is immune from prosecution, and it seems he is once again the true leader of Turkmenistan. From a distance, it looks like nothing makes sense in Turkmenistan, but dig a little deeper and you find recurring themes: invasion, colonization, exploitation, repression, corruption. And through the centuries, the victims are always the same: regular people. For as long as global demand for the country's huge natural gas reserves remain high, and the government maintains total control over its production, it's hard to see things changing. But Turkmenistan's people, especially its youth, are learning about what lies beyond their closed borders. The problem is that, as the country becomes an important player in the global energy industry, and therefore geopolitics, the regime's grip on power will only become stronger. The country's political leaders won't willingly relinquish control. But as long as there is life, there is hope. Thanks so much for watching.